Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us in tonight's webinar. Before we begin, please note that participants' microphones are muted throughout the meeting, and webcams will not be used in this call. To participate in the discussion, you may type your questions or comments in the chat box, and the speaker will be answering a few questions in between the presentation, and there will also be a question and answer at the last part of our session. So I will now pass on to Sir Siddharth to begin the training.
Thank you, Cha, and welcome to everyone. Thanks a lot for joining. To those who are new, as well as those who were there with us in the last session. So this is the series of capacity development sessions which we have organized here from the side of the openIMIS initiative. I am Siddharth, working at the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute based in Basel. Today I will be talking about, now we'll get into openIMIS, and I'll be talking about in a general way some system characteristics and then really delve into what kind of data is captured, reporting, etc. Just in terms of sort of learning outcomes, so the last session we tried to get you to think a little bit about processes in your health financing schemes, in your country context, the different mechanisms which you have encountered, you have perhaps worked with, um, and hopefully by doing that kind of reflection, you will be able to relate to openIMIS. So now we'll delve into openIMIS and talk about how actually these openIMIS supports these kind of digitization of such processes. Today, the focus will be specifically on access and reporting. So how do you access the system, and how do you look at the data that's all being captured in the system. I would hope that you will leave knowing how to create, very specifically, how to create accounts and how to view some of these reports. Now that we go into the system, I would also just like to add that now the next series of similar sessions that we will hold, we will try to practice how to use the system, so you are able to, in a hands-on way, really do this yourself. And at the end, if you would all be up for it, I would also suggest a sort of a case study, which is setting up your own insurance scheme from your context, from your example. So what kind of how you think it really functions, what kind of products you have on offer, so what kind of coverage do you have, how does a provider payment mechanism work in your context, just to try it out on openIMIS. So as we go along, I'll give more details, but just keep that as the kind of broader picture. Today, what I will do is essentially break up the session and cover these points. So firstly, starting with data flow in general, how data flows through the system, how do you access the system? And just to add, in the data captured part, I will actually not cover the first three topics, just in the interest of time. And in the coming sessions, I will go more into details with this. So I wanted to start with an overview, but I won't do that right now. We'll just go straight in the next couple of sessions in more detail on beneficiary related data claims as well as configuration related. So let's start with the first part. So now really delving into openIMIS. The first point I wanted to talk about was generally the concept of how data flows through openIMIS. The system, essentially, the essence of the system is really that it's managed in a centralized manner. So you have a central server. Transaction that you undertake needs to somehow come back to the central server and move forward with that. So you are allowed to do certain sort of decentralized actions, but they also at some point need to come back to the central server. And this is required really to maintain some kind of coherence of transactions which are happening everywhere, because there can be certain things changing in time, and these cannot always be reflected everywhere if all the transactions are done in a decentralized way. So this is why the main system really sits at a central server level, undertaking all transactions. And then as it shows in the diagram, so there is this online part, and this is essentially anyone who has access to the system then connects through the internet and is undertaking their transactions. There's also the mobile phone, which is on the right side of the diagram here. Certain transactions can also be undertaken with a mobile phone, and when you have internet connection, you can directly then make these transactions and uh, interact directly with the central server. So all the information is kept there. In case there is a situation where the mobile phone, for example, is in a remote village where you do not have internet connection, then you also have the possibility to take that information somehow physically transport it to another place where there is an internet connection, and then upload it onto the central server. And then there is also this part which is called the so-called offline. So some transactions can also be undertaken in this so-called offline mode. So the idea was there were some implementation cases where there were some facilities, for example, which did have hardware. So they had a computer, but then the internet connection was not regular. They requested a so-called offline module, which is some transactions which they can still do in an offline form. So just for example, the claim submission that they could do on their computers. So even if they don't have internet, they can undertake these transactions and then uh, again move it to a place where there is internet connection and then upload it so that the information gets updated in the central server. So that's in a nutshell kind of an overview of how data is really being transferred. Now going specifically into mobile phones. So mobile phones, there's essentially two mobile phones which we have, two mobile phone applications which we have. And these are really around two key roles or which are undertaking majority of the transactions. The first one is called the so-called insurance agent. So it's the kind of outreach mechanism. I use the term here enrollment officer because that's the terminology you will find in the system. And this is essentially the person who is responsible for firstly going out. So if you remember from the last session, the outreach part, getting to a household, capturing their information. So that's the first part of their responsibility, to capture the information on each individual, the family, what kind of money have they paid, what kind of coverage product that they have signed up for. All of this information is captured on this mobile phone app. So after a period of time, when your insurance coverage expires and you decide to renew, the information which then needs to be captured at that point, that's part of this renewal of a policy. So all this information is then also captured on the application, which is then used by this insurance agent or enrollment officer. And then you have the part around feedback. So in openIMIS, we have a process where when the claims are being reviewed, so this is after the treatment has happened, a claim was submitted from a health facility to the purchaser, the insurer side, and then while scrutinizing the claims, they decide they would like to double check something or have some feedback from the patient who was actually treated. So in the system, it can trigger then a request to the respective enrollment officer who's responsible for the household where the individual, the patient belongs to. So the person who would have enrolled them essentially, as ideally in most of the implementation cases, this person is also belonging to the same village where the household was enrolled. So it's possible for them to go back and collect some feedback from them. And all of this is then captured as well by the enrollment officer in their mobile phone application. And then you have the health facility side. So the health facility side, first of all, again, if you remember the process which I described before, one part was really when an individual comes to a healthcare facility, how do you know who this individual is? How do you know what benefits they are eligible for as part of the benefit package which is offered by their insurer? So this part is the retrieving of the coverage, which is also which is undertaken by the app, and then the part about submission of claims. So once the treatment is done, the health facility then charges the insurance scheme for providing that care. So that's the provision of care, and these are all then captured into the app. So two apps, as I mentioned, one on the enrollment officer side and one on the health facility side. We're doing all these transactions. Data flow with mobile apps. So now specifically with mobile phone apps and how they function, one key part is, of course, if the phone is to act allow in a decentralized way collection of information, it needs to have some basic information. So, for example, the enrollment officer who's using the phone needs to know what an insurance product costs. If it's per individual, then what will be the price for 5 individuals in a family or 10, or in a similar way, the list of villages or so that they are supposed to cover. So there's some basic information which the app needs to get. That's called the master data from the central server. So this can be downloaded directly on the phone. At this point, only a code for the enrollment officer who's responsible for doing this data entry, or the claim administrator, the CA here, who is going to do a data entry at the health facility side. They just use their code. They do all the data entry in an offline manner. So at this point, you don't need to have any internet. All transactions are done on the phone. Once that's completed, you can then upload this data, and that's where you use the so-called login credentials, so user ID and password, so that we know that authorized personnel are adding this data. Then there is also a scenario which can be completely offline. So for example, you can have a mobile phone in a very remote part where, let's say, there's no internet and you can't even get this master data. You cannot connect to the internet to get this master data. So the same data can essentially just be taken in form of an extract. So somewhere where you do have an internet connection, you can download this extract and then transfer over this extract physically to the place where the phone is, put it on the phone, and then in the same way, the enrollment officer or the claim administrator does data entry. And then again, if the internet is not available, you cannot upload this. And hence you can then take out an extract from the phone, take it physically to another place where there is an internet connection, and then using your login details, upload that information into the central server. So that's the data flow within mobile phone apps. The offline part then, which I mentioned briefly before. So in this kind of scenario, as I said, so the use case would be, for example, a healthcare facility which has a computer, does not have regular internet connection. How does it work? So here again, the first step is really, like I said, with mobile phone apps, there's some starting information which is required. So that's basically what you do. You download an extract from the server. So at some place where you do have internet connection from the central server, you download a data extract. This information then is physically transported to the place where this offline machine is, which does not have internet connection. And you basically upload the data extract here. Once you upload the extract in an offline setting, then someone does the data entry. So if you have 50 claims, you can enter the 50 claims or 50 enrollment applications. These can be entered. Once they are entered, they are then downloaded from this offline machine, a machine which doesn't have internet. Then you again physically transport it back to a place where you do have internet connection. And then if you're authorized, you have a login credential, you can then upload this extract. At this point, Cha, I would ask you to perhaps just give the poll results. So I hope you were able to follow the last couple of slides. The answers were in there, and you can show the poll results, Cha. So for example, the first question here, the claims app is used for, a lot of people said actually feedback, claim submission, and undertaking renewals. That's not the right answer. So as I mentioned here, the claims app is basically for checking the coverage, so inquiring about an individual's eligibility, as well as submitting claims. So just that part. Feedbacks are done by enrollment side, the enrollment app. Yeah, and the other bits, the answers were wrong. So basically it was the third one, which is inquiring about an individual's eligibility and claim submission. Second one was, at what point in the mobile phone app does the user need to enter their password? Here again, I think majority of the answers were wrong. Majority said when a new household or a new claim is entered. Here actually the answer was when the data is uploaded, which was the second highest response. So as I mentioned before, when you're entering a new household, that's the transaction which you're undertaking on the app. So you don't need to have internet at that point. When you need to have internet is when you actually upload the data. Sorry, not internet. You need to use your login credentials at the point when you really upload the data. All right, thanks, Cha. Is there any questions at this point, or shall we move to the next block?
There are no questions so far, Sir Siddharth, so I guess we can proceed to the next part.
Okay, perfect. Let's move then to the second block which we had. So this is now really to do with access to the system. So I talked a lot about logins, etc. And today I will not go to the actual application. So I will do that more in the next sessions. But I will ask you to definitely go there and log in. So please follow this part quite closely. I will use only screenshots, but it's also a way for me to just see whether you are able to navigate a little bit. And let's see how intuitive the application actually is. So I will try to give you the screenshots and the explanations here, but then in the breakout room would ask you to try it out yourself. Okay, so first of all, the access to the system, it's really based on role and location. Essentially, you belong to a particular geographical area and you have XY or X role or Y role. And that's what I will now show you in detail what it means in openIMIS. So the location is really split into different levels. There's something called profiles, and this is to define what a role is. So a role could be, like I said, I mentioned two roles before: enrollment officer and a claims administrator. Role could also be a manager, an accountant. They have different tasks to perform. So the profiles is where you define what these roles are, what they're supposed to do. And then the user account creation and allocations. So the user account creation is then actually creating a user and then allocating a location and particular roles to them. I have given in the instructions, you will basically also in the breakout session try to go to this demo server that we have. You have some login ID and password there. This is by default there. So you can all easily access, but I would ask you to create some accounts from your side and then test it out later. There's also a French account in case someone would like to try it in French, but the by default is in English. So once you log um, in your front page, the landing page, you will basically see this thing on the left corner. So the good morning is just indicating the username here, and what you see below that is what I mentioned about roles and locations. So in this case, the location is split with region, with district, and then roles, you see there's a lot of long list there. So the long list is just indicating number of, sorry, the different roles. So this particular person, this particular user account has many different roles which have been attributed. Same with region, district, there's multiple locations which this person is responsible for. So this is possible. It's also possible the person is just responsible for one role, one location. So this can be configured in the system. But essentially when you log in, that's how you get this basic idea of what you're able to see and what not. Locations, when you go into the, on the top bar, you basically have this administration, and at the end you have what's called locations. And later on, when you all go there, I would hope that you are able to navigate this on your own. And within locations, you'll then find this kind of an interface. So you have basically these 4 levels. The levels, any geographical locations can be split across these 4 different levels. What you see here is regions, districts, municipalities, villages. You can also have different wordings for it. It could be village development community, a ward, etc. But essentially there's these 4 levels which are available in openIMIS. Later on when you go, I won't explain. I would hope you also find it a bit intuitive, and when you go there, you can basically add with this plus sign and try to add a new region and under that a district, municipality, village, etc. But I would hope that yeah, I would ask you to really try it out once on your side and enter this data. One thing to flag is when you go to the level of villages, there's also some additional information that you see there with regard to male, female, split of the population which belongs to that village. Now, this is not mandatory. You can leave it blank, but just for your information, that's added because in some schemes, there are so-called capitation formulas which are applied, which also have as a parameter the population in a particular area in a particular village which is catered to by a health facility. So the payment to the health facility is also tied to the catchment area of that health facility. So if it's catering to a lot of population, then perhaps they should be paid a bit more. So in those kind of context, this data is useful to add. But in your case, you could just try to ignore it and in a simple way try out these different levels. Next, as I said, user profiles. So user profiles is also under administration, user profiles. And here what you're essentially doing is, as I mentioned before, creating certain roles. So when you go there, you'll find a list which looks something like this. And these are the so-called system defined roles which we have. So in all the scheme implementations, we found that generally speaking, they had role divisions across these kind of roles. So these are the accounts which are created from default, and that's what you see here under system true. It's just flagging that these are there by default, and one can then add more user profiles here. This is a bit restricted in terms of who can actually do it because so it requires a special admin login to actually make these changes. But the idea is that these are the standard roles which are existing in the system, but in case there are additional needs. So just as an example, maybe in some scheme there is an external donor who's also involved, and they are not interested in doing any transactions, but perhaps they're interested in looking at one or two reports. Maybe they would just like to see how many enrollments have happened in a time period or so. So you can create this donor and then give them access to the respective things. We'll see when you go into a particular role, this is essentially a mapping of the whole system, the different modules which are there, different reports which are there, etc. And you can essentially in the role then allocate what this person is supposed to view, edit, etc. All right, that's the higher level kind of user profile. Now going into specific types of accounts. So there's two special accounts here. The so-called enrollment officers, who I before mentioned manages the enrollment app, and then the claims administrator who on the health facility side does the claim submission, etc. Um, so basically here the enrollment officer, we have a different interface to create these profiles. And part of the reason was that in earlier applications, they did not require a login ID and password. And this has been changed as we moved along. But so this is why there's a different entry point for creating a new enrollment officer and a claim administrator also for sake of continuity of older applications while we are upgrading the system. So um, when you go into an enrollment officer, you basically have this again basic information. So a code is always important. That's what becomes subsequently the login ID of that particular enrollment officer. So this enrollment officer is, let's say, located in a particular location. So in this case, a particular region, a district. And you can also then, if you want to further go down the levels, you can also indicate that perhaps the person is only responsible for one particular village within a municipality in this district and region. You can also have the same person maybe responsible for more locations. So this is the kind of access that you're setting here. Standard things, information, birth, email address. One important thing here is what's called substitution works too. And this is essentially to say if someone was doing enrollments in a particular area for, I don't know, 200 households, then how do you, and the person decides to leave, how do you now transition these households to someone else? So this is what the substitution is for. It says this person will work to a particular date, and after that, everyone gets transferred to the next enrollment officer who's selected. And while doing this, you should also select this include login and enter a password there in a language, so that this will then automatically create a user, and that's the login ID would be your code, and the password would be what you put in here, and that's what you will then later log in. These are the credentials you will use to later log in. All right, so this is how you do it also in the enrollment app. So I mentioned before, the key things were when you download your master data, your starting data, you use your enrollment code. And then whenever you're uploading any information, so any of this uploads when you're doing, you will then need your login credentials, which I mentioned is your code and then the password that you place in. Similarly, claims administrator. So now on the health facility side, here again, you will indicate similar details on the individual. You have the code, etc. And you have the important part, which is a health facility. So you allocate this individual to a particular health facility. And again, include the login here, enter the password. So here again, that's your login ID, the code, and then your password is what you put in here, and that becomes your login credential also subsequently, whether you log in directly on the application or whether you log in from the mobile phone app here. And then users. So like I mentioned, all of these are users. Enrollment officers, claim administrators are users, but for reasons I mentioned before, they have a special entry point. And then users are also I mean, you can create users from here for other roles, especially. So you have, again, similar details, emails, password, etc. that you put in. And on the right side here, you will essentially see the part about roles and locations. So you can say this person is an accountant, is only managing one region or two districts, whatever. You can make these combinations here. So that's the user account. This was simple enough, and not to make it too complicated, I would just stop here briefly. We will now move into this so-called virtual breakout room. What you will now do is you will be split into smaller groups. We'll give you, say, around 10 minutes. And then after that, you will be brought back to the main session. And in that time which you have, I would ask you to firstly help each other out, try to figure out from your side how this whole thing works. And what you would do is really go to this link here, demo.openimis.org, use the provided login. So that's how you get into the system. And I would ask you to do three things, which are mentioned in the bold ads here. So firstly, if you go to the locations, please add a location on your side, at least one under each sub-level. So you don't need to have 50 villages under a particular or multiple districts under a region also, just one region, one district, and so on down to village. Just add location from your side, and maybe a small hint, just add your initials to it, because probably a lot of you might maybe would enter the same information and later you'll find it difficult to identify. So perhaps just add your initials so you can identify the location the same way as I explained now. Then I would ask you to go to users and add an account for yourself with these two roles which I mentioned. So just go straight to users, create a new account, add your own user ID, password, etc. And in the tick box, just say Scheme Administrator and IMIS Administrator. And at this point, you can leave the location all, or if you want, since you've created your location should pop up. So just select it and allocate it to that, which means you're a Scheme Administrator for your particular location. And just to test it out, you can then log out, log in again, but this time with your new account which you have created. And once you do that, if it's not working out, then also you can use the admin account and do the last part, which is create a new enrollment officer. But ideally, if you can, try to use your account. And if you're in your account, if you've given the role scheme administrator, you can essentially log in again and then add one new enrollment officer in the way which I explained right now. And do this for the location that you have created. So the enrollment officer that you create, don't create it for all the locations, but just for the specific location that you have created. All right, I hope this is straightforward. Please ask around with your colleagues to help you out. And at any point, if you have questions, once you come back, please put it in the chat. But I hope you're able to navigate through the interface and able to do this. All right, Cha, could you please put everyone into a breakout room? I think we are all back. I hope you were able to try it out. If you had any problems or had any questions, do put it in the chat. And I just realized maybe we should also share some way with you to communicate subsequently. I mean, it was now just to try out in the small time that the little time that we had. But please feel free to the demo server is there. Feel free to try out this exercise also later. And if there are any issues or questions, perhaps we can give you some email or so that you can write. But at the same time, we have the so-called wiki page where you would have got the details on how to register, what's the content of the module, etc. Maybe you could also just use that and directly put in if you have any questions or so subsequently. Just put it in there and we'll try to then respond to you. All right, I hope it was you were able to try out at least one of these, if not all of them, but at least one. I will now move on to the third block, which I mentioned, which was around data captured. And here, in the event, because of limited time, I won't talk about what comes in, but really what goes out. So from a reporting and data analysis point of view, what are the key things which are there in openIMIS? Firstly, just to kind of categorize a little bit, there's what we called a standard operational report. So there's a lot of things which were required when we were developing the system as well, a lot of requirements which came from the managers of schemes on how do they monitor, how do they track their scheme. So a lot of these were then turned into standard operational reports. There was then, of course, a request also to look at, there were more requests on more customized reporting, more additional reporting, um, and all of this is then covered under the so-called customizable reporting options. So firstly, on the system that you have, the demo server, again, if you go there, what you find is under this tools reports, you will find a large number of these standard reports, which I mentioned, the standard operational reports. Um, all of these reports come with their own, you have to look a bit carefully with the kind of filters that they have, because they are specific to the type of report you're looking at. So maybe somewhere it's on a monthly basis, somewhere it's on a, you can literally see on a daily basis or so, and accordingly filters are there. What are these reports? So as I mentioned, it's looking across all the transactions which are happening in the system. So it's really across the management of different families, the individuals who are part of the families, the so-called insurees, the policies, so related to the product, the coverage which is being provided, the premiums, so the collections which are being done, as well the claims. So whatever is being submitted by health facilities, being paid out, etc. The reports are essentially quite a large number, like I said. Operational reports, for example, around policies, claims, these are really on a transactional level, how many people, how many policies were sold in a period, etc. Split by gender, all of this kind of information is there. There's derived operational indicators. So these are more complicated things like, for example, renewal rate. So these are more calculations which are being done. Some additional derived indicators, as it says, which are there in the report. You have contribution collection, so all the money that was collected, perhaps across also locations, split by locations, villages. So some of these splits are in these reports. Product sales, so also who's selling, against the enrollment officers, who sold how many policies in a time frame, etc. Contribution distribution, this is specific to a type of payment mechanism, so-called relative pricing, where the money that is collected in a period of time is distributed towards payment of claims over a different time frame. So it just tells you what is available towards payment of claims if you're using that mechanism. User activity report, these are standard ones. These are really talking at the level of transaction, who logged in, who did what activity. So more logs which can be seen. There's then enrollment performance indicators. So again, more derived figures on enrollments, status of registers. So this is really in terms of under administration, all kinds of things which are being added, like accounts, number of hospitals, or health facilities which are configured. These kind of things are there. Insurees without photos is a lot of, this was really on the operational side. If individuals were sent, but then photos, for example, were not sent, so to be able to track that. Matching funds is to do with external funding, so not related to specific premium contributions, but external subsidies coming in to be able to account that when you make payment of claims. Claims overview give you really details of which claim came in, what was approved, rejected, etc. Referrals give you an idea of referrals cases vis-a-vis others. Family and insuree overview, so really details of each if that's needed for some reason, for reporting purposes, monitoring purposes. Pending insurees, this is individuals which are in the system, but for some reason products have not been activated or not allocated to a family. So the insuree is in a kind of pending state. So for further follow-up. Renewals, so as I mentioned before, renewals related statistics. Rejected photos is really around pictures which were sent, but for some reason maybe the ID did not match or so got rejected. So some kind of tracking of that. And the capitation payment is again with a different payment mechanism which is supported, which is dependent on different parameters on a formula. So this report just gives figures across the different parameters and kind of calculates that formula. So these are really the standard reports which are there in openIMIS. You have, like I mentioned, different filters. There's variations in that by locations, products, etc., which they can be generated, and then they can be taken out in different ways. So Excels, PDFs, etc., which you can export the file, then the report into. So this is really the chunk around standard reporting. Now, in terms of dynamic reporting, one of the things that has recently been done with openIMIS is its integration to DHIS2. And here it really is used for a lot of these customizable reports. So essentially what's happening is all the transactions that we have in openIMIS, this is in the beginning I mentioned it's kept at a central server. So all the operational database is in one place. This database is then connected through a FHIR reference module. Uh, and on the DHIS2 side as well, there's a DHIS2 FHIR adapter. Uh, Through that communication, then essentially records on an individual levels are then taken from on the openIMIS side into a DHIS2 tracker, where it's then aggregated. And then at the level of aggregation, once the aggregations are done, you can then create dashboards out of it, as a lot of you might know, using this DHIS2 solution. And this is just an example of what these dashboards can look like. So as a lot of you might know, within DHIS2, you can look at aggregated information across different parameters and try to create, whether it's graphs, other visuals, maps, tables. You can create these and add it to these dashboards as you have here. I've put in a link at the bottom there, and maybe one of my colleagues who's on the call can also share this with you. You can also have more information there. There's a test instance where you can go log in and try to look at some, it's some dummy data right now that's there, but then how that's visualized then into DHIS2. So at this point, I will stop and perhaps ask Cha, is there any kind of questions that came in the meanwhile?
Yes, Sir Siddharth. Our first question asks, can you assign more than one role and more than one location to a user?
And that's basically when you log in with the admin account as well. That's what I was trying to show. If you see the login when you have on the left side, top left of the screen, there were lots of different roles. So in that case, my admin account was actually allocated many different roles. And that's why you were able to see everything in the system. If you got to the point where you created a login for yourself with the roles which I mentioned, the scheme administrator, when you log in, you will notice you don't see everything. You only have some functionalities which are accessible to you. But with an admin account, you were able to. So the admin account which we have is actually an accumulation of all the roles and all the locations.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Our next question is, can we modify the level of region?
The level of region, meaning the terminology, if that's the question, then yes, in different contexts. So in some cases, maybe it's called province. In another case, it's called a region. Depending on what your terminologies are, you can go up to these 4 levels and you can customize in your local implementation context. What you see here, the terminologies, these are the standard ones which is just kept in the in the demo server and in the application when you download it. But once you implement in your context, you can also change the terminologies based on your geographical terminologies. The only kind of restriction here is you can go up to a maximum of 4 levels here.
Our next question is, are codes validated or can you use any format for the codes?
Right now, in the version which you have, there's no checks there. If you want, you can create. I think the only check is the length. So it's alphanumeric, some restriction on the length, but you can, of course, you're free to create your own logics, because also a lot of schemes use their own logics. They have maybe a code for location and then a serial number for hospital or a health facility, whatever. So the version you have here is just a generic one with just a size restriction, but you're free to then also create more additional logics when you apply it in your country context. But you would have to then build that in.
Yes, thank you, Sir Siddharth. Our next question is the openIMIS scalable to add more modules, and is it compatible with ICD-10?
In so you can of course add more modules. I'm guessing that's more about programming new modules, etc. So since it's open source, you have the source code, you can build more modules. In terms of ICD-10, I'll cover in the registers in the subsequent sessions. um, and in the way you diagnose a particular treatment, a claim which comes into the system, the list you can upload. So you can then decide whether it's an ICD-10 code that you follow to diagnose, or whether it's ICD-9. Depending on the local context, you can have that. We've also had, for example, in Tanzania, they've also moved from one to the next version from 9 to 10. So that's also been accommodated.
Thank you, Sir Siddharth. Our next question reads, when I add a new enrollment officer, the only region I can choose from is ULSA. No other regions are being shown.
And that probably is because you have logged in with an account which has some restrictions probably. So like I mentioned in the order, if I'm guessing that person probably went to the third step of the three things which I said to add in that order. So you must have created an account which had the system administration role, and it had a particular location allocated to it. So when you log in, probably that individual can only be given that location.
Yes, thank you, Sir Siddharth. I think that is the last question from our participants. I'm also seeing new names from our list of participants. Maybe you can invite them to our next session, sir.
Absolutely. And I think to everyone, I think Cha mentioned, we've sent out certain emails, and otherwise, maybe Cha, in the chat, we can just drop the link to the wiki page on the training resources. And that's basically giving you an overview of all the different sessions that we'll conduct. And you can then register there as well. And please do join us for subsequent sessions then next 2 weeks. I'm guessing there's not more questions. What I did here was on the slides, I added a few questions here. So if some of you want to still play around, there's more kind of trivia I've put in here. And I would encourage you that when you go back, these slides are also, by the way, on the same wiki page. So this one wiki page has all the information for registering, slides, etc., which I use. All of this is in one place. You can go there and look at it and also try to answer some of these questions. So you get to play around also with the reports and get some idea of, uh, so you know where to find what.
Thank you, Sir Siddharth. I think there's one more question. Maybe we can address it. So,
Mhm.
is it possible to customize metadata from front end and via admin accounts like THIS2, for example, the need for changing data fields?
I mean, it's a bit mixed, I guess. Not really from. So you're probably talking in the context of reporting. So just the operational data on the IMIS side. The link which I gave, if you go there, you will find already some definition, some information on what information goes at the level of individuals. And there's also then definition of what indicators are there in that dashboard. So you can find all the information on what data goes through firstly from the system. And right now, I think the effort was to try and transfer over all individual related, claims related data over. So you can have a look there firstly, whether what you need is covered or not. And then look at I mean, the indicator definitions, you can also add additional indicators. That's more on the DHIS2 side. Maybe the starting point, just to answer your question, would be to look at mapping which has been done this is on the link and just seeing what kind of data elements are going across. So if you want to add more, probably you will have to make changes to that, the fire adapters, etc., which I mentioned, to also make sure more data gets through. But the mapping will at least tell you what all is getting through. I hope that answers that question.
All right, so
But
thank you to all our participants, and thank you, Sir Siddharth, for your time and expertise for helping the AHN community. So we will be sending you the follow-up materials. So we expect to see you again in the following weeks. Thank you, everyone. Keep safe.
thank you. Bye bye.